Asbestos is the generic term for a group of 6 silicate minerals. Characterised by long, thin fibres, asbestos is strong in tension and resistant to fire, heat, electrical and chemical damage. The amphibole group includes chrysidolite and amosite, more commonly known as blue and brown asbestos respectively. And the serpentine group includes chrysotile, or white asbestos, the most widely used form of asbestos. From the late 19th century, thousands of tons of asbestos were excavated to make plaster, roofing sheets, ceiling tiles, fire breaks and partitions. And industry used huge quantities in brakes, boilers, electrical goods and as lining in pipes. However, as early as 1898, the UK Chief Inspector of Factories reported that asbestos had easily demonstrated health risks. Then, in 1927, in the British Medical Journal, the term asbestosis was used for the first time, cited as the disease responsible for the death of 9 workers out of a group of 10 that had been heavily exposed to asbestos. Today, the International Labour Organization estimates that 100,000 workers die each year from asbestos-related diseases, all of which result from an accumulation of asbestos fibres in the lungs. And according to the UK's Health and Safety Executive, tradesmen and maintenance workers are most at risk.
Well, here in the studio to talk about the risks and regulations associated with working with asbestos is Sarah Muller, who's Head of Asbestos Policy at the HSE. Sarah, goodness me, loads to cover on this. Can we start really on an update on the status of asbestos? Are all 3 types just banned in the UK?
That's right, they're banned in the UK and throughout Europe.
So, and of course, we're talking about, well, they get referred to by different colour types, don't they?
That's right, yes.
Not that it's necessarily easy to see when you're looking at it. Slight differences between when they were banned?
Blue and brown asbestos were banned in 1985 and white asbestos was finally completely banned in 1999.
And as we heard then, there's something like 100,000 workers are projected to die each year from asbestos-related diseases. And presumably, are these people who were working with asbestos before all these bans and so on came in?
That's right. Asbestos diseases take anything between 15 and 60 years to develop. So the people, unfortunately, who are dying now would have been exposed some years ago before the risks were fully understood and before bans and other controls came into place.
So the sort of jobs, the sort of trades and so on that were particularly affected are like what?
It would be people working in the manufacturing industry when asbestos products were still produced, shipbuilding, railways and other industrial processes where asbestos was used for insulation, gaskets and so on.
And is it true to say that blue and brown asbestos are more dangerous than white asbestos?
What the research shows us is that those 2 types of asbestos are significantly more hazardous than white asbestos is. However, they are all classed as carcinogens by the World Health Organization, and the research does show that all 3 types do lead to asbestos-related diseases.
So you've got blue and brown that I think they've been proven to result in lung cancer, for example.
Lung cancer and mesothelioma and other diseases of the lung as well.
But all asbestos has to be treated as dangerous. That's, of course, the main point.
And white asbestos will lead to and can cause cancer as well.
And to the layman, I mean, it's almost impossible, really, to tell the difference between the 3 types of asbestos, isn't it?
That's right. The colours actually refer to the asbestos in its raw mineral state, but once it's been put into products for commercial use, then it's very difficult to tell the difference. I've got some examples here that you can see. This is blue asbestos, which is sort of grey in this instance, and this is a fairly pure type, which would have been used for insulation.
And fairly rare now.
And fairly rare now, has not been in use for some time.
And again, we have to remind ourselves, it wouldn't necessarily look like that anyway, but that's its raw state.
That's right,
That's blue asbestos.
Yep.
Next one you've got there is...
What we have here is an example of asbestos insulation board. This would predominantly contain brown asbestos, and as you can see, it's very difficult to identify that. It's just part of the material itself.
Yeah, but that's actually what it would look like.
Yes.
What it looks like there. And the final type of the 3?
And the final type, this is asbestos cement sheet, which is quite commonly seen, and this predominantly contains white asbestos, although in a fairly low percentage. And again, you can see it's very difficult to identify.
And clearly, I mean, you've got it there in a pot, in a bag,
Yes.
and that's where it's going to remain, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because of the danger. All right, thank you very much for that. I mean, we're talking about the dangers, but the fact is that white asbestos isn't banned in the United States, is that right?
Yes, as far as I understand.
Yeah, and it's used in China, Russia, India, I saw.
Yep.
Is it right that it should be lumped in with the other asbestoses as well?
The international scientific consensus is that all three types are Class 1 carcinogens to human health. So in the UK and through Europe, they are banned. The UK legislation actually does recognise that there is a difference in the level of risk, and some of the controls that are required for blue and brown asbestos materials and more hazardous types aren't applied to some work with lower risk materials.
And we should point out that in order for it to be harmful, the fibres of the asbestos actually have to be in the air, have to be inhaled, don't they?
That's right, absolutely, yes.
And so I take it from that the form of the asbestos is important.
That's right, as we've seen from some of the materials. How the asbestos is actually incorporated into another material makes a big difference as to whether it's how likely it is to be released, and also the amount of asbestos that's actually in the material. So asbestos cement, for example, will have something like 10 or 15% asbestos, but it's held very tightly in a matrix, so the ease at which those fibres can be released is much less than in something like the loose lagging, where it can be released quite readily.
Right, well, before we move on, let's remind ourselves why those bans were put in place.
There are a number of asbestos-related illnesses. Lung cancer, a malignant tumour of the bronchi which has a latency period of at least 20 years. Mesothelioma, a cancer of the lung lining which almost always results in death 1 to 2 years after diagnosis. The disease takes 30 to 40 years to develop. Asbestosis, a slow progressive disease caused by scarring of the lung tissue that becomes apparent 15 to 30 years after exposure. Diffuse pleural thickening, a non-malignant disease in which the lining of the lung becomes scarred and which may result in breathlessness.
OK, so that's the background. In a moment, what to do if you come across anything suspected of being asbestos. But first, let's hear a summary of the rules and regulations that we'll be referring to.
In 2006, 3 sets of existing regulations governing asbestos were brought together as one new set, the Control of Asbestos Regulations 2006. The regulations cover 3 main areas: the ins and outs of the asbestos ban, although this has since been superseded by new EU regs, the control of asbestos at work, and finally, the licensing of those involved in the asbestos removal and control industry. Now, for the rest of this programme, we're going to concentrate on Regulation 4 of the Control of Asbestos Regulations 2006, the part that refers to the duty manager.
So, Sarah, are these regulations a statutory requirement?
They are. They're actually made under the Health and Safety at Work Act. So as well as the regulations themselves, there are general duties under that Act that go beyond the specifics of the regulations themselves.
And there's a duty to manage as well. That's all part of it?
That's right, yes.
So all that has to be taken into consideration. It's there in the law. Who has the duty, then, to manage it?
Right, the duty to manage applies to non-domestic premises and common parts of domestic premises, like blocks of flats, for example. And who has that duty is, in essence, the person or the persons who have responsibility for repair and maintenance of that property. Sometimes that might be complex because of the tenancy or lease agreement, so it's important that people actually check and understand what what responsibilities and duties they actually have.
And there are codes of practice that are relevant to that?
That's right. There is an approved code of practice published by HSE, which is called the Management of Asbestos in Non-Domestic Premises.
I was going to say, it's interesting that, I mean, the term you're using, the term we're talking about, the duty to manage, not to remove this stuff.
Absolutely. The regulations don't require proactive removal of asbestos. What they require is that the asbestos containing materials are identified, assessed for the particular risk that they pose in that environment, and then, depending on that, managed accordingly, either to leave them in situ, seal or encapsulate them, or, if necessary, remove them. But that would be sort of the last step along that process.
So where, then, might you leave it in situ?
The types of situations would be where you've got asbestos-containing material in very good condition, in areas where it's very unlikely to be disturbed during the normal use of the building, and possibly areas perhaps that are out of normal use. So they might be in, maintenance areas which are locked, or ceiling voids, or other areas where people generally aren't going to be, and you can manage access to there.
Right. So if I'm the facilities manager of an office block, what are my obligations in terms of asbestos management?
Right, OK. Again, depending on the actual contract, but assuming a facilities manager would have sort of overall control of maintenance and repair, the key things are, first of all, to identify where asbestos materials would be, to actually know where that is, look at their condition, and then taking into account the use of the building and who's there and how likely that material might be disturbed. And that would include not just the normal use of the building, but foreseeable maintenance that has to take place.
Right, and that's a survey?
A survey is one possibility. The regulations don't actually talk about the word survey. They talk about inspection and assessment.
Right, so the difference between an inspection and a survey, and there is a difference, is what?
I think, really, as I say, that it's because the regulations don't use that word survey. So, for example, if you were in a small building which was relatively simple, with a small amount potentially of asbestos there, it might be sufficient for you to do a simple inspection and leave it at that. Whereas normally, I would think most circumstances, a survey by a trained, competent person to actually look in more thoroughly at the premises would be necessary, and that might then include taking samples for analysis to actually confirm whether asbestos is present.
And is that a legal requirement to carry out an inspection?
To carry out an inspection to identify where asbestos might be. Equally, the regulations do allow for the duty holder to presume that material might be asbestos if there's a strong indication. So it's not always necessary to take actual samples. So you can make that presumption, but clearly then, if work subsequently needs to be done, you'd need to confirm what you were dealing with.
All right, so, and I know we touched on this earlier, but just so we can get this in our minds, in a non-domestic building, where would we be looking for asbestos? Where could we find it?
Right, I mean, asbestos materials were very widely used. They have very good properties for insulating and fire protection. So just about anywhere in a building where those things are required. So it might be in fire doors, it might be in panelling around building columns, it could be in ceiling voids as fire breaks, it can be around pipes as insulation in boiler rooms and so on. So it's many and varied, which is what makes it quite difficult to go through this process of management.
I mean, it was seen as a great material once upon a time.
Absolutely.
It's there all around the place.
Yeah.
So that, well, let's return to this business of carrying out an adequate survey. What on earth is an adequate survey?
Right, OK. I mean, this is something that is covered in some more guidance that the Health and Safety Executive has produced, which is called the Asbestos, the Survey Guide. And what that explains is that depending on the purpose of the survey will depend exactly what you need to do. And there are two main types of survey that should be carried out. The first one is called the management survey, which is really designed for the general duty of management through the normal occupation and use of the building. So that would require that asbestos materials are identified, condition assessed, and a management plan put in place. And also, that very importantly, that where work is done under normal maintenance contracts, that information is passed to the people who are going to do that work, so they can manage accordingly to that.
Oh, right. I was going to say, who has access to the information? Is it just people who need it, or can anybody with an interest?
Anybody with an interest. The duty holder is required to provide that information to anybody who's likely to disturb the asbestos-containing material, so anybody who's going to be working and breaking into the fabric of the building.
So then, when you find you've got asbestos, what are you meant to do?
Right. Well, if you suspect that you may have asbestos there and you want to confirm that that's the case rather than just make a presumption, then you'll need to get a suitably trained person to take a sample and then have that analysed at an accredited laboratory. That's the only sure way to actually identify exactly what you're dealing with.
But, I mean, this involves a very strict process, doesn't it? Which they presumably have to adhere to, identifying it, isolating it, labelling it, presumably?
Again, it rather depends, again, where the asbestos is. Labelling is one option, so it's clearly obvious, but sometimes that's maybe not appropriate. So you can use colour coding and also permit to work systems where you actually restrict access to the building for work to be done through a management system. So you're absolutely sure the information is passed on at the point it's relevant.
But a decision can be made, can it, on whether the asbestos stays there and is labelled or has to be stripped out?
Absolutely.
So who makes that decision?
And that will be down to the duty holder on the basis of advice. If they employ a competent person, the survey work that they do will help them make those decisions. And again, it's very important that the actual use of that particular building is taken into account when deciding the best course of action.
There is, of course, a concern that a lot of the companies who come in and do surveys also offer a removal service. And there is a concern that it's in their interest to find it and also point out the risk it poses, now it has to be removed and so on. Is that something that one should be a little wary of?
Certainly there are companies who do offer both services, but there are plenty of independent surveyors out there, and it really is the responsibility of the duty holder to ensure that if they are going to use a third party, that not only are they competent and have the relevant experience and qualifications, but they also are independent of other interests, and that they are actually working in the interests of the client rather than for another organisation.
And that's down to, as you put it, the duty holder.
Absolutely,
they've got to make sure
their
of that.
responsibility.
And is there a duty of care when it comes to training and asbestos awareness?
Under the regulations, every employer has a responsibility to prevent exposure to their employees, if at all possible. Where that can't be done, then it's a case of reducing that to the minimum that's achievable. And awareness training is a legal requirement for any employees who might be exposed to asbestos in the course of their work. So that would include, quite a wide range of people, and those also who might supervise those that would do those types of activities as well. OK,
well, that's material for another programme. But before we go, Sarah, it's worth reiterating, I think, isn't it, that the risk from asbestos really only occurs when people start interacting with it.
That's right. It only is a risk to you if the fibres are released into the air in a way in which you can breathe them in.
All right, well, Sarah, thank you very much indeed for coming and giving us your thoughts. We've got plenty more information on the subject of managing asbestos in the study notes that accompany this programme. But from us here in the studio, until next time, goodbye.